Hi again, I'm Brad McLean, co-founder of Regulation Asia. From a regulatory standpoint, NFTs are not that easy to pinpoint. I mean, fungible tokens, they represent different rights and liabilities, typically broken into three distinct legal categories: a security, a currency, or a utility. But NFTs, they can do all of that too, making them tempting to bundle into, I guess, other crypto assets. Already, governments around the world are tackling this NFT conundrum directly by breaking them down as separate categories of functionality, like fungible tokens. Luxembourg, for example, has categorized NFTs into three distinct types: financial instruments, electronic money, and collective investment instruments. However, there are other numerous functions NFTs can theoretically do, and I guess understanding how to evaluate revenues deprived from them can get really, really messy along the way. And this is precisely why frameworks built into NFT marketplaces and self-regulation efforts are so important. And this is what brings us here today to our panel governing the frontiers, Web 3.0, GameFi, and the golden age of NFTs. I'm a little overwhelmed, to be honest, by our panel. I mean, a couple of heavyweights here that really understand this space. In our panel of experts, we have Malcolm Wright, founder of InnoFi Advisory and chair of the Advisory Council for Global Digital Finance. Welcome, Malcolm. We have Evan Auyang, Group President for Animoca Brands. Welcome, Evan. Kevin Bock, founder and managing director for Blocks, and Allison Owen, research analyst with RUSI in the UK. Welcome, Kenneth and Allison. As a starting point, first things first, lots of buzzwords in the title for this panel, but I guess what's the difference between Web 3.0 and the Metaverse? And how do NFTs and GameFi fit into these new ecosystems? Ken, Malcolm, could you share your thoughts?
Can you hear me?
Oh, hi.
Okay, Ken, you go first, and then Malcolm, I think you're on mute for a second, but please.
Yeah,
okay.
I was on mute there. Sorry, yes. So I was just sort of saying that I think that we are entering a whole new world, not only of terminology, but of the way that the world turns and how it's going to affect our society and everything. So if we go back even 1 year, I don't think many people were really talking about NFTs, Metaverse, GameFi, and everything else that goes around it. But now we have this connected ecosystem. So it all started with crypto and blockchain, and those technologies led us on this path into what we're now starting to see emerge. So if we just take the web for a moment, we go back to web version 1. That was building of websites, and you had very static content or simple databases. Then around 2005, we started to see the emergence of Web 2.0. That was more social. So you started to create some of your own content on Facebook and other sites at the time. And we started to see more sharing services like YouTube or Spotify or any of those. Now we're entering this world of Web 3.0, where it's very much more driven by smart applications. So we might see autonomous smart contracts driving things behind the scenes. That's not contracts written by clever lawyers. That's actually just contracts that can execute themselves based on certain conditions and logic. So that would include things like machine learning, big data, blockchain, so decentralized ledger technology, and so forth. Now, the way this all interacts is if you want to get into this world, you will typically need certain types of token. And that might be either in the form of an NFT. An NFT is really just a technical representation of something, and it's unique. So it could be a technical representation of, or unique representation of, a piece of art or something like that, or even something that you play within a game. So typically you would take a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, you would buy this token to get into the game, and then you would get into the game. Now, if we start to look at the whole ecosystem, then the metaverse is really just almost like a virtual world in which you can enter to then play a game. Imagine it Ready Player One, if you want to put it into sort of film terminology. You enter into a world where you are then able to access, whether it's art galleries or games or things like that. GameFi comes into this because you need tokens to be able to move around the game and to be able to sell things. And that can be in the form of either like a cryptocurrency token, or it could be in the form of an NFT, a non-fungible token, which is a unique representation of something.
Kenneth, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, definitely echo Malcolm's points there. Maybe just to kind of pry apart Web3 and Metaverse. Web3 obviously is an evolution of Web2 with the ownership layer, right? So concretely, on a technical front, that ownership layer is represented by the wallet on the user side and the blockchain, which is sort of like on the server side. Now, when you talk about the Metaverse, it's probably the narrative so far is around virtual environments, 3D virtual environments. So think about Second Life, Roblox, Fortnite, Sandbox, and Decentraland. So there is an element of a kind of a real world presence with the Metaverse. But certainly in the case of, say, Sandbox and Decentraland, NFTs, of course, are representing in-game assets like virtual land and so forth. So they are distinct but interconnecting terms.
I mean, and apologies maybe for my naive view, but it seems at the moment, when we look at NFTs in the market, most of them are static artworks. They're JPEG avatars, I guess things that we could broadly categorize as collectible. But of course, not all NFTs are created equal. I mean, Evan, what are the practical use cases for an NFT? And I guess why are communities buying them?
Well, yeah, the traditional way of understanding NFT is that they're representative artworks, etc. But the way we, the creators of NFTs ourselves, do not think of it as just merely collectibles. They actually serve a certain utility that brings together certain communities that believe in the same thing. So yes, an art collection of 10,000 Bored Apes would represent a community that believes in that part of artwork, or CryptoPunks, being some of the more original. And earlier arts of this form, and a lot of people may not comment on the art itself, but really talk about what they represent in terms of a community that believes in the Web3 space. But for Animoca brands, what we do is that we invest into a lot of companies in the space in spurring the ecosystem, and we also have portfolio companies that we either wholly own or we have a majority stake into, that would build NFTs that have actually utility. So for example, the Sandbox itself, being one of our most mature companies, would actually be considered to be a metaverse, where you have brands, you have independents, creators that would then build out these worlds for experiences to bring together differentiated communities, right? You might be in a land doing one thing and transferring, teleporting yourself to another community doing something else, right? So NFTs themselves, and it's very important from a regulatory perspective to look at this, right? It really isn't just about collectibles. It is really about community building. So for us, our philosophy really isn't going to be around, if we built this game or we built this metaverse, how much money would we make? What is the monthly average users, right? What is the user trend? We do not look at stuff like this. We're literally looking at things like, what are we building in terms of community? How would the community be brought together? What is the gap we're trying to fill? And how would they benefit from that? And we only benefit if there's a community benefit from it. So all the tokens, as you talk about, are utility tokens, right? Obviously, there will be governance tokens that is about, how do we vote on certain things, so that all of the games or the metaverses that we built will be decentralized, so they'll be governed by the community. So if without delivering community value, we won't exist.
Excellent. I mean, yet again, there's a lot to unpack there, and I love how you've differentiated between, I guess, collectibles and investment, and I'd like to deep dive into that in a second, but just kind of picking up on the regulatory theme there. I mean, as previously mentioned in the introduction, Luxembourg is considering a framework. Korea is also considering, has mentioned that they're looking to monitor NFTs, and the US SEC plans to also require NFT marketplaces to apply for a license in the near future. But at this point, it seems that there's a clear lack of regulatory frameworks. I mean, Malcolm, from your expectations, when do you expect regulators to start looking more closely at regulating NFTs, and where do you expect the focus to be?
So I think the first part is actually understanding that not all NFTs are equal, as you mentioned earlier, and as Evan was mentioning earlier. So for example, an NFT that represents, for example, a property, if you used it for your land register, an NFT for your KYC, which is also being looked at the moment. Those are maybe different from, for example, an NFT of a profile picture of, a collection of 9,999 images, generative art. So there are different use cases, and I think each of those has to be considered in its own right. And this is, as if we looked at the Financial Action Task Force in their paper last October around virtual assets, this is what they were saying, that each regulator needs to look at this in its own light and look at the risks around it. But it's very important, I think, that we draw these distinctions between these different types of NFTs and how they are being used, whether it's utility, whether it's security, for example, collective investment and fractionalization, or whether it's for some other purpose, which may not represent security, or it could just be used, for example, as a digital ownership title to a piece of physical art or a collectible. So the underlying principles, I think, are going to be around consumer protection. And how we ensure, for example, that the system is not being misused. And I think that will be the focus for regulators, that looking at, for example, money laundering risks or so on, or whether it's around market manipulation or price, the price equality, for example, or price discovery. Those will be the factors. And I think looking at this from the industry perspective, the more the industry is looking at this responsibly about how do we protect the users on our platform, make sure things are genuine, et cetera, the easier this flow will become. And it's also key for there to be a public-private partnership. So a liaison between regulators and the industry players, the key industry players, to understand how the flow works, understand how these industry participants are working together, and what the different types of NFT are, in order to reach a point where if there is going to be regulatory oversight, that it's suitable, it's appropriate, it's built in the way that is supportive of innovation, because this is a hugely innovative area that will have the potential to change so many aspects of our society in a positive way, that we don't want to sort of curtail it, but at the same time we do need to manage the risks appropriately. And I think that's the way that the conversations will likely proceed.
It's really interesting that you're putting, the investor protection, the integrity of marketplaces before the financial crime aspect there, which, to be honest, it seems, at least from the crypto experience, has been the flip way around. And that potentially could be around the FATF's position. I mean, Allison, I'm going to be a little bit mean here, because I know it's very early on your side of the world, but earlier this morning, David Lewis, the ex-executive secretary FATF, referenced exactly what Malcolm just said, that, NFTs from their perspective are collectibles. Alex Kim, who's on the same panel, he's the CEO of Upbit, also mentioned that the vast majority of people, from his perspective, are potentially buying NFTs, not necessarily for collections, but but based on investment purposes. Based on this assessment, and I guess my fundamental understanding of the FATF rules, shouldn't this mean that NFTs technically fall under FATF obligations, thus requiring regulators to set guidelines? And I guess more importantly, does this mean that the regulation of NFTs, at least from an AML perspective, are inevitable?
So I do think that's just a great example of what Malcolm was just talking about. There is going to be a case-by-case basis when it comes to this. You have just taking NFTs representing artwork. You could really make comparisons to the real-world art market. I could, for example, buy artwork for $50 and not expect to make money off of that. That's not to say that that will be the same case as maybe NFTs used in a different method, but it really will have to be by case basis, and it will be up to this jurisdiction to actually determine what that adaptable approach will look like.
Well, I mean, to clarify, I have some artwork for sale if you would like it for $50, but we can talk about that later. I mean, in the short term, Evan, from your perspective, do you see the platforms or the platforms that you're engaging with are differentiating between investors and collectors? And if so, how?
Well, like what Allison just said, right? I mean, regulations are important in all parts of the world, because you do have to think about, investor interest and protection of assets, et cetera. But ultimately, let's not forget that a lot of real world regulations already exist to protect investors, right? So for example, regulating the art market is a regulated market, right? Through common law system that as we know, and in most jurisdictions, they're already like that. This is just the digital representation of the same thing. And also, there are different types of NFT assets, right, that we just talked about. There are collectibles, there are utility like a sword within a game, or a race car within a game, or an avatar that you might, create and buy and sell. And those are actually utility, right? So if you are thinking about regulating, on that, it's very important to think about, how is this different from the actual physical world, right? And while it's important, let's really, again, we really should, really think through the transformative nature of blockchain opportunities that really represents in shaping the online space, right? I mean, we were actually very freeform skeptical of the internet in the 1990s, right? We're afraid of e-commerce, right? Paying for things online. There were many great companies and services built thereafter. And don't forget that there were actually frauds and scams at that time as well, right? There's a lot of actually advisory against transacting over the internet, right? That was the beginning, and that was what we refer to Web 1.0. In Web 2.0, we moved to social media, peer-to-peer networks, and transactions as well, right? And then self-expression, social connections, etc., has been transformed, and ultimately, data became platform, right? That was the problem with it, and ultimately benefited only a handful of monopolistic companies like Facebook, Google, etc., right? Now in Web 3, right? It's backed by blockchain, which we have known for a number of years already, that it will be transformative, not only to the online world, but also to the physical world, right? This is decentralized, unhackable system where digital asset ownership is enabled. This is the only thing that really changes, digital asset ownership, right? So, and with this world, then NFTs, right? So beyond euphoria and the speculation and talk about our investor protections and all that stuff, we really need to focus on what is real about Web3. Right? It ultimately unleashes the creators' economy, where artists, journalists, gamers, right, for what we do, KOLs, anyone else making content, they're then able to stand on their own, right? It's a power to transform music, art, education, many other important industries, right? It allows creativity to be correctly priced and creations of artists to be valued through true organic discovery rather than via powerful corporations, right? In that light, how does a regulator, thinking through the existing regulations now, tinker with it so that these elements of true digital asset ownership can be layered onto healthy development on this industry? I think that is the most important purpose of what we're talking about in regulations.
So, I mean, Evan, clearly you're obviously from the growing the ecosystem side, the investor side, and you can see the potential for this. Malcolm, you're obviously, historically from the compliance side. Do you see it from the same light?
No, I'm not going to do it. I kind of do, actually. I think Evan's right. We do have existing mechanisms. There are existing mechanisms for fraud protection and that kind of thing that exists within the ecosystem. If we consider, let's say, art as a regulated factor, then and art regulation around the world, then it's quite limited at the moment as to where that exists. But there's the obvious. Okay, we have to look at some things around whether it's fraud or people losing money, but at the same time, as we've been saying all along, not every NFT is the same. They're all different. And if you earn a sword or a car in a game, then that has a completely different aspect around its utility, the way it can be transacted, the risk that it poses, versus some other mechanism that may be a higher risk. So everything has this risk-based approach. And we need to consider it in its entirety before we sort of say, okay, we're going to rush ahead with a blanket regulation that NFTs should all be regulated. I think having that balanced approach, and this is where we really need that interaction and discussion with regulators early to be able to promote where we see the ecosystem growing, why, how, the level of risk that it poses or doesn't, and how we can control those in a streamlined way. I think what we are seeing emerging now is a completely different way of looking at every ecosystem we have, whether it's financial or societal or gaming or economic, whatever it might be. And the potential to take that with us and find new ways of doing things, including how we manage financial crime risk and fraud risk. I think we have that potential emerging through all of these new technologies. So the power to be able to use that, I think, will be very, very strong and compelling, and that's perhaps the way we need to promote this discussion.
So the points on fraud and financial crime, I just want to put in the pin in that for a moment and come back to it. But you know, we've been comparing and contrasting, obviously, NFTs to art ownership in traditional art markets. I mean, Ken, and apologies if this is a very simple question, but you know, what rights does the ownership of an NFT confer? Is there any legal status or recognition over these rights? And I guess more fundamentally, how does the management and governance of these, you know, ecosystems work?
Yeah, so this is like the number one question about NFTs and IP. The short answer is no. It doesn't confer IP, right? What you own a token. You know, you own a cryptographic receipt on the blockchain that you in fact own this token. Whether or not the token is linked to the IP really depends on the terms of use of the issuer, and concretely. Maybe I can share two examples. One is CryptoKitties from Dapper Labs that has a more strict kind of, you can only use it for personal use. And in fact, in their terms of use, they kind of say if you are using it for commercial use over $100,000, you know, that's not allowed. Whereas on the other hand, you have something like Bored Apes, which is they are a lot more lenient with so you can use your Bored Apes and print t-shirts with it and make money with it, right? And we've seen the evolution of these two NFT communities go in a different way. So in regards to you really have to check on the terms and conditions of the issuer. So that's one. And you know, where marketplaces are concerned, with a marketplace like OpenSea, it's like any other big platform out there. They expect you to have the ownership rights for the works that you're looking to sell on the marketplace. If there's a dispute, if someone else is using your IP, then you can raise the dispute on the marketplace. But there is no standardized way for managing the IP, because that's a cross-border legal framework.
Okay, so what I'm getting from this is, yet again, not all NFTs are created equal. It sounds like I need to get some t-shirts printed up after this, because it's kind of it seems that it's that point that we need to keep reinforcing. But I want to go back to that fraud and financial crime kind of point. I mean, Allison, as I understand, even in the UK, you know, they've recently seized 3 NFTs as part of a tax fraud investigation. From your perspective and your research, are you aware of any cases of or enforcement actions involving NFTs against, I guess, either organized crime, terrorist financing groups, or other money launderers?
So just to start, the UK seizure of an NFT was just a great achievement. I think that we're heading in the right direction for that. It's one thing to actually investigate cryptocurrency cases involving financial crime, but actually seizing assets is a whole different story. So that was a great achievement. The cases right now are very limited when it comes to NFTs. There are reports of even OFAC sanctioned addresses holding NFTs and reports of wash trading. But I think that 2022, sadly, we are going to see more of those cases come to be. I think with NFTs, there's this great chance, because we see these recorded on the blockchain when NFTs are minted, that there's a great opportunity here to mitigate the risk before anything too crazy actually occurs moving forward.
So yet again, you mentioned something there about sanctions, and I just wanted to drill down on that just for a second, because I think we're getting some conflicting messages. This morning we had TRM saying we don't think it's a major issue at the moment, but maybe a future issue. Then we had Niels from Refinitiv, who was talking about 554 sanctioned wallets. You've just mentioned that you've seen NFTs connected to sanctions entities. Do you see that this is potentially a sanctions risk given everything that's happening?
Only time will tell whether that risk is going to be a high risk or not, but there have been reports by blockchain analytic companies that I've actually seen sanctioned addresses holding NFTs. There haven't been any cases, as far as I'm aware, of NFTs being used like a standard money laundering tool. But again, only time will tell to see how high of a risk this actually is when it comes to moving illicit funds.
So just taking one step deeper then, so when we look at it from a financial crime perspective, is it the NFTs, how they're created, or the mechanisms in which they're bought and sold that are potentially the problematic issue?
So it's not necessarily the way that they are created. Minting NFTs and having a traceable view of where these NFTs are coming from, that actually adds a huge amount of transparency into investigations. But again, you have to worry about things like art forgeries. You had the popular example of the Banksy case where some criminal went out and developed this NFT, minted an NFT, and actually promoted it as if he was Banksy. You have cases like this that you really need to make sure that you can authenticate the person actually selling the NFT. So most of the financial crime risks come to more of these novel cases where you have art forgeries, you have people's accounts being hacked into and stolen NFTs being transferred out of their accounts. So again, this is just a perfect setting where you can really mitigate the risk before things start to accelerate.
I mean, Malcolm, from a financial crime and compliance perspective, how does GameFi fit into this discussion? Does it even fit into this discussion?
I think indirectly. Okay, so let's say, for example, you are going into a game and you need a token to be able to buy an NFT. To buy that token, you will normally buy that in a primary crypto. So you might buy it with Ethereum or USDT or USDC or Bitcoin. But you do say, for example, you'd start with your fiat currency. You take that to an exchange and you exchange it into eventually the token that allows you access to the game, and then you're into the game, and then you can earn your NFTs. You can cash out those NFTs back into your token. You go back to the token to cash that back out for your primary crypto or back into fiat. Now, the key to all of that is actually you're going through a centralized exchange. And if all of this is actually a blockchain transaction, and you mentioned TRM earlier, then you've got a flow. You can already see the flow of where those funds have come from and where those funds are going. And if you're going through a centralized exchange at some point where you do your KYC, where there's travel rule, which is the other side of what I do. So if you look at all of that, then actually the gateways in and out become quite sophisticated and quite solid. And give some even more transparency beyond the fact that you can see the flow in and the flow out. You can then see at some point who is behind the transaction. So the transparency of the blockchain actually makes it a harder place to, let's say, do anonymous financial crime than perhaps you might see in traditional finance, which is reflective of the scale as well. So, the majority of financial crime is still recorded in traditional finance, a much smaller proportion in crypto finance, and then GameFi is just an even smaller proportion under that. But when you use a game token, you're only really going to use it in, within either one game or a suite of games as a selected ecosystem, and you're going to sell your NFTs within that game or within a suite of games. So it becomes, in a sense, a little bit closed loop, and that in itself helps to mitigate the risk.
Yet again, it sounds like, based on that discussion, that the blockchain is not a great place for a bad actor to hide. But yet again, that's where the bulk of the regulation is focused. Any particular reason why?
I think just because of the speed at which this has happened and the fact that you can transact quickly. So if you looked at crypto, it's like, okay, you can do cross-border transactions very fast, and it's scaled very quickly. If you think the whole ecosystem is what, 10, 12 years old, if that, in terms of real maturity, compared to a financial system that's hundreds of years old. So it's come out of nowhere. The regulations need to adapt to this to be able to maintain that. But I think the other side of this is to actually look at the recovery rates. So we saw last month this huge asset recovery in the US. We've seen a huge asset recovery in the UK. You don't kind of typically walk in and when you're doing an asset recovery and find $1 billion sitting there waiting to pick up. But here we see this happening in the US, for example. So those kinds of scales of recovery are easier once you have the flow, once you have the understanding of the analytics, once you have the KYC or some mechanism through that process to get it. I would say it's beginning to develop, particularly as we see the emergence of crypto regulation around centralized finance, around those primary parts of transaction and travel rule. That helps to solidify the system and make it harder to transact illicit transactions that might otherwise take place.
So I appreciate we're talking a lot about regulation. I mean, this is a regulatory focused event, but we're obviously taking a very centralized view to a natively decentralized asset class. I mean, Evan, is this the right approach? Is the industry maybe potentially better off self-regulating?
Well, obviously, every industry needs to self-regulate to an extent, but it's still facilitated by regulators, right? Let's be clear about this. We're talking about regulations, right? But we are a little bit premature talking about regulation of the NFT space when the regulations on the crypto layer isn't even all that sophisticated yet. That's what we need to focus on a lot more, right? So there's a lot of discussion of, stable coins, about, other cryptocurrencies, which are issuing authorities and things like that. And by the way, ultimately, what we need to get our heads above is sort of like away from the fear, uncertainty, and doubt craft discussion, right? This is a new technology, right? New, not in actually a number of years. It's actually been around for a long time, but new in terms of how many people are actually getting into this space, so it becomes mass adopted. Again, going back to this internet, the invention of the internet itself in the 90s, there are a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and parents would ban their kids from going on the internet because of how dangerous it is, right? That's not the way to do it. I mean, if you look at a new asset, the only thing that's happened right now on the blockchain is that it enables true digital asset ownership, and therefore it becomes investable, and therefore there's some FOMO and speculation on it, right? Imagine that, any asset can be used as a vehicle of crime, right? Even a car. Imagine in the horse-drawn carriages days, and all of a sudden a car is invented, and let's ban cars because they're dangerous, you can hit people. And by the way, if you rob a bank and get away faster as well, then you ban cars. The logic goes as this, right? So something may not be a greatest analogy, but then I'm just trying to bring forth the point that when something is new, you don't know it. Therefore, we understand the essence of it, and therefore, how do you regulate so that it becomes healthy, so that this technology can benefit everyone, right? So on the side of actually money laundering and tax, by the way, is the other thing that is important, right? So there are existing mechanisms that can guard against that. So KYC processes and enforcement of those actions by folks are actually important in some cases. And like Malcolm said, right, a lot of in terms of theft and fraud, NFTs and one of the blockchain space are actually one of the worst places to do it, because you can right now what you can do right away if your art or your collectible is stolen, you notify the exchanges like OpenSea, Wearables, or wherever, and then you file a police report, you tweet it, and you say that these are stolen assets, and you isolate the wallet, and those art pieces may not ever be worth anything because OpenSea and those and the exchanges flag them, right? So as to a physical piece of art, it's actually untraceable, right? And in terms of forgeries, there are forgeries in real world as well, right? In all sorts of art that are actually forged as well. But actually, in the blockchain world, there's a lot more checks and balances in terms of how you can check for authenticity. So yes, you do have to be careful. Yes, this is new. And even for investors, I would say that you have to do your own homework, right? Don't go in there and watch a couple of YouTubes, a couple of recommendations, or look at a new project called whatever it's called, and then believing in it and say that, okay, this is great, let's just go into it, right? Any investor in the physical world or on the online world can actually run away with your money if you don't do your own homework. So that's what we would advocate.
So I can see Ken and Malcolm nodding their heads, so I think I know what their opinions are on this. But I want to see from our researchers, Allison, you focus on proliferation finance, terrorism finance, financial crime. Do you believe that self-regulation is the way ahead?
I think that self-regulation is very important, but I also think that there's a necessary need to standardize how these marketplaces are regulated. Again, there is this opportunity where you can have this transparency, but it's really just taking that extra step and doing that monitoring, whether the marketplace itself goes about that regulation or actually having that standardized. But I I think that a standard approach to this is really critical.
I mean, Malcolm, a standard approach, I think that's your experience with the GDF has been focused on that. How successful did you find self-regulation with the building up the GDF kind of frameworks?
I think we started very early on, I think, gosh, almost 4 years ago now, putting in place an AML code of conduct for GDF members that was adopted well. I mean, it provided it was everything you expect to see in a high-level policy around AML, plus blockchain analytics, which is fundamentally, if you're still sitting on the traditional finance side, you need to know that crypto is basically the same. You do the same activities in an AML program. It's been very good from an educative perspective. It's been very good to bring new compliance folk up to speed in this space. Then we've set up other working groups. We've written papers on tax. We've got working groups looking at market integrity. We've got groups looking at stablecoins. We'll be starting up a group looking at NFTs, and it really helps to lay those foundations. The other work we did was to develop a standard for things like travel law. So co-founded the group that was called InterVasp that produced the IVMS 101 data format, so similar to our Swift message format. Again, that was adopted by the whole industry. It just made things flow easier. Now, there was no legal requirement to create that format, but by having it there, it just demonstrated, okay, we understand what we're doing. We're going to collaborate with one another, even though we might be competitors. But the other side of this is actually what we've found is that whereas the expectation might be, and I'll use the crypto exchanges here as the example, where you might think that, if I do KYC, I lose my customers. What you find is you gain trust, and you gain trust with retail, you gain trust with institutions, that actually your business is secure and solid. Now, that doesn't necessarily require regulation. It's just an approach as to how do I balance my risk? How do I look at where the risks are? How large are those risks to my business? And how do I then mitigate them? And can I collaborate with what might be seen as competitors in order to mitigate and flatten out some of those risks that could be across different platforms or geographies or whatever it might be? And this is where GDF has worked well, in addition to having this very strong regulatory bond. So speaking regularly with the FATF, speaking regularly with different regulators about, as I said earlier, that public-private partnership. How do we educate each side so that we build something that's appropriate, or determine actually being self-governing is for the time being able to balance the risks efficiently? And those are the kinds of conversations that I think we need to be having, because they were the ones that really drive forward where we're going to.
Okay, so I think that we're hearing that self-governing, but a standardization, which I guess means that things can move across borders easier, right? There won't be that regulatory fragmentation. But I do think I had a slight aha moment where I realized I might be a little bit more naive than I expected, because I've assumed NFTs are all about the retail market. Evan, from your experience, is there any institutional participation at the moment? And if so, what are their goals and ambitions?
In NFTs, institutional participation, there are a lot of it. I mean,
okay. What are they doing? Why?
It's kind of like the institutions in art, collectibles, utilities, etc. Right? So so institutional in terms of forms of for utility especially, right? Buying up I don't know, Axes and Axie Infinity, right? And buying out the different weapons or whatever it is to facilitate the hiring of workers, quote unquote, or players who would go into there and become employment, right? So there's a lot of institutional participation in that. Institutional participation in NFTs in terms of collecting an asset of value, right? So there are some collections or some NFTs that are deemed as going to be long-term valuable to the community, and therefore becomes part of their asset base, right? So that's sort of what we're seeing today, and there are increasingly more and more of that. But obviously, that exists more in the world of more famously in fungible tokens and non-fungible tokens, but increasingly so because the space itself is gaining a lot of credibility.
So it also seems, so we've talked about obviously financial crime, fraud, we've talked about, not all NFTs are the same, but one of the key challenges I realized beyond regulation appears to be for the market is liquidity and price discovery, which again will lend to opportunities for wash trading and price manipulation. I mean, Ken, one, is this true? How big is the issue? And I guess what are the responsibilities of marketplaces to potentially address these forms of misconduct?
It's definitely happening. You can certainly buy and sell the NFTs to yourself. You can create multiple wallets, and wash trading is an issue. I take reference from the way that the crypto industry has evolved over the last couple of years. The issues around the hygiene of the data, shall we say, that's reported to CoinMarketCap or CoinGecko has definitely cleaned up in the last number of years, right? And that's a function of the big exchanges needing to be reputable places of conduct if they are taking a much longer term strategy around it, which actually is a point that I also wanted to mention around self-regulation, is that what I did take heed was that last year FTX actually reduced leverage from 100 to 20, and then Binance followed suit in the same amount. So actually self-regulation and coordination amongst the major players is happening. Now, with marketplaces like OpenSea, they certainly have an obligation to kind of stamp this kind of behavior out, but there are limitations to what they can do. They can employ services like elliptic and chain analysis, and implement some kind of policy that's implemented on chain. But this gets into the nuances of what is technically possible with a decentralized system, right? So a lot of it is best efforts basis.
Malcolm, do you agree? It's best efforts basis?
I think the tools are in place, and it's to assess the extent to which it might be happening. So at the moment, if there's no regulatory guidance on it, then it would be. We saw an NFT platform close down in the US last week, or the week before, because they cited that they had activity that was unwanted or too much activity. But if there are efforts, there are the tools in place that can be used, and that again, it's back to mitigate the risk that you have identified, then by all means, then if you say, well, actually, a huge proportion of my transactions seem to be self-generated, and the tools would identify that, then you would take action to correct that, or to monitor that, or to report that, in order to build that trust with your customers that actually you have authentic products for sale, and that it can be trusted that the price is realistic and being generated by the market rather than the individual who created it.
We have a couple of minutes left in this discussion, and I was just really wanting to get your thoughts on what's next. As we look over the short, medium, and long term, where are kind of the areas where you think either there's going to be either increased regulatory scrutiny or kind of other concerns? I mean, Evan, what are your thoughts for the next 12 to 18 months?
I think the present concerns are still the current, are still going to be the concerns 12 months from now, because regulations are always trying to catch up with the innovation of the industry, right? So ultimately, it is really about, money laundering, right? It will be about tax collections. It will be about financial stability. That's all existing in the crypto layer, right? And to a lesser extent, retail participation and unsophisticated, participation in mass frauds and all that stuff. We have to, guard against that. But ultimately, the way what I'm advocating is that this is a decentralized world that we're entering into, which is supposed to be trustless and permissionless, right? And the power of that is unleashing a lot of creativity, a lot of self-ownership that could transform the world, right? So regulators need to educate the participants, industry participants, how do we better self-regulate, right? Rather than sort of like, this is a slap on the regulation, this is what it is not allowed, right? Don't lean on fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Really lean a lot on the goodness, in which there's a lot within the Web3 community about what we want to do, what we want to accomplish overall, right? Which is really a force of good. If you roll forward the clock about 12, 18 months from now, my biggest prediction is that there'll be a lot more sophistication actually in the self-regulation side, and a lot more technology on the side of actually protecting consumers and participants and institutional investors than the regulators who have moved, especially in the NFT space. Because the first layer that needs to be thought through is really about the most important things, which is again, is stability, money laundering, etc.
Excellent. So education, not regulation, and sophistication. Anything you wanted to add, Kenneth?
Yeah, I kind of note the mainstream, like for instance, GameFi. You have companies like Ubisoft that are coming in, so a lot of the mainstream corporates and brands are certainly looking at how to activate their NFT strategy with games on one side, and then there's also luxury goods on the other. So I think as we have more traditional players coming in, there's going to be a lot more process and a lot better frameworks around safety for consumers. And I think that's going to grow in tandem with regulators getting a better handle on the technology and better frameworks around the new tech.
Excellent. Investor protection. Malcolm, Allison, and final words.
Allison?
I just think that, again, with the NFT space, NFTs are being used for different things at this point. You even see it related to real estate. So you're going to have to start thinking about all these different new forms coming out and how you can have an adaptable approach to regulate all these different spaces.
So new forms of innovation. Malcolm?
I think three things. I think we're going to see the platforms, and I'm going to echo Evan here, we're going to see the platforms evolve and get stronger. We're going to see those who are participating, so the customers, to become much more savvy about risk and be able to choose wisely. And then I would hope that what we will see is a public-private dialogue to help us map out those risks, not just on a country-by-country level, but actually on a regional or global level, that we map out what those risks really are, identify the different types of NFT, and then from there can determine what the most suitable approach is to manage those risks.
Excellent. So it seems like, to be honest, in the past 45 minutes, we've definitely had a lot to unpack, but it sounds like education, not regulation, a focus on investor protection and market integrity, as well as, the challenge of implementing new innovative products into the future. With that, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists, Malcolm Wright, founder of InnoFi Advisory and chair of the Advisory Council with Global Digital Finance, Evan Auyang, Group President, Animoca Brands, Kenneth Bock, founder and managing director of Blocks, and Allison Owen, research analyst with RUSI in London.